Welcome to the Appalachian Historical Review. This is the audio home for AppalachianGenealogy.com. Each week, we dig into the records, migration paths, and the real stories of the people who settled the Appalachian Range. We're here to look at the actual documents and the everyday lives that define our heritage. Now, let's step into the records and look at what the documents themselves reveal.
You know, when you look at a modern map of the United States, especially the eastern seaboard and like the Appalachian Mountains, there's this expectation of, well, a really orderly progression.
Oh, sure. Like a textbook.
Yeah, exactly. It's almost like watching a time-lapse video in your head, right? The settlers arrive on the coast. They slowly and steadily march westward. They neatly draw all these county lines. And history just sort of smoothly unfolds from right to left.
We definitely like to think of history as, a steady march of progress, neatly categorized into these nice chronological chapters. I mean, it makes for very clean reading.
Right. But then, and this is what we're getting to today, you step into the actual on-the-ground reality of the 1760s and 1770s American backcountry, and suddenly that neat little map is just completely shredded.
Oh, it's totally chaotic.
Yeah.
The frontier landscape at that time was just a massive mess.
It really was. So, for today's deep dive, we've got an incredible stack of sources covering a little-known pre-revolutionary civil war called the Regulator movement.
Yeah, and it's a fascinating one.
It is, and the mission for this deep dive is to unpack how a group of North Carolina farmers got, absolutely crushed in a battle by colonial elites, and how that exact defeat accidentally mapped out the American frontier and fueled the settlement of the Appalachian Mountains.
It's honestly a massive study in unintended historical consequences.
Right. Plus, we're going to look at why the victors and the losers completely swapped sides a few years later during the Revolution, and finally, how you, the listener, can use the weird, fragmented paper trail they left behind to track your own ancestors.
Absolutely. Because to really understand why this happened, and how that paper trail actually works, we have to look at who was populating that backcountry in the 1760s.
Okay, set the scene for us.
We're talking about a huge wave of immigrants just pouring down the Great Wagon Road, which was this treacherous, super rutted dirt path stretching from Pennsylvania down through the Shenandoah Valley and into the Carolinas.
And these definitely aren't the, wealthy aristocrats in the powdered wigs we usually picture in colonial movies.
Far from it. I mean, we're talking about Scots, Irish, German, and Welsh settlers.
Yeah.
They were largely what we call yeoman farmers.
Which basically means they're doing it all themselves, right?
Exactly. They were small, independent family farmers who worked their own land for subsistence. So they weren't operating these massive commercial plantations. They were just trying to feed their families and maybe, have a tiny bit of surplus.
Just scraping by.
Yeah. And they settled in the Piedmont region of the Carolinas, which created this really profound immediate demographic shift.
Because you suddenly have two completely different worlds just forced to share a single colony.
Yes. You get an intense cultural and economic clash.
Yeah.
So on the coast, in the Tidewater region, you have the established wealthy elites. These were planters whose wealth was entirely tied up in large estates, in slave labor, overseas trade, that whole system.
Right. And then out west.
In the West, you have these newly settled, cash-strapped frontier farmers. But the catch is, the colonial government was entirely controlled by those coastal elites. They were the ones writing all the laws for the frontier.
Which is a recipe for disaster.
Completely.
And before we can understand why these frontier families eventually packed up and literally fled into the mountains, we really have to understand what they were fighting against.
Right, the root cause.
Yeah. And the sources point out that regulation meant two very different things depending on which Carolina you lived in. Let's look at North Carolina first.
Okay, so North Carolina.
The farmers there were protesting systemic corruption by local appointed officials, right? This network they called the courthouse ring.
Yeah, the courthouse ring.
Okay, let's unpack this. How did that corruption actually function on a, day-to-day basis for a normal person?
Well, the system was entirely predatory. It relied on officials who were appointed by the royal governor, William Tryon, who just sat comfortably on the coast in New Bern.
Far away from the actual problems.
Very far. And these local officials, like the infamous Edmund Fanning, who is this Yale-educated justice of the peace and recorder of deeds in Orange County, they basically held a localized monopoly on legal authority.
It's the analogy I thought of is it's basically a localized monopoly where the referee is also the opposing team's coach. You literally couldn't win legally because the corrupt sheriffs and judges were the exact ones writing the rule book.
That is a perfect way to describe it.
Right.
And they manipulated that rule book masterfully. Because here's the mechanical reality of the frontier economy back then. There was a severe shortage of hard cash. Specie, they called it.
Right, people are just bartering.
Exactly. Everyday people traded in barter. Grain, livestock, pelts, whatever they had. Yet the sheriffs began demanding that taxes be paid exclusively in hard currency.
Which they knew the farmers didn't have.
Precisely. They would routinely refuse perfectly good agricultural goods. And when a farmer inevitably couldn't produce the hard cash, well, the sheriff would just seize their property for back taxes.
Oh, wow.
But instead of holding a fair public auction for that property, the sheriff would rig it. They might hold the auction in secret, or post the legal notice on a tree deep in the woods where literally no one would see it.
So no one shows up to bid except the sheriff's buddies?
Exactly. The only people who showed up were the sheriff's friends in the courthouse ring. So they'd buy a prime working farm for mere pennies.
Man, that is just outright legally sanctioned theft.
It really was. And then you add extortionate legal fees on top of that. If you needed routine paperwork filed, the clerks would just invent exorbitant fees. And to compound the injury, there was a flat tax rate in the colony.
Wait, a flat tax meaning, like, everyone pays the exact same amount?
Yes. A flat tax meant that a poor subsistence farmer, carving out a living in the dirt, paid the exact same numerical tax as a massively wealthy coastal plantation owner.
Which just disproportionately guts the working class. And to make matters worse, I was reading in the sources that much of this tax money was being siphoned off to publicly fund Tryon's Palace.
Oh, yes. Tryon's Palace.
This lavish new home and state capital for the governor in New Bern. So you have farmers literally losing their land just so the governor can have, like, a nicer dining room.
It was incredibly infuriating for them. And we see early protests, like George Sims' Nutbush address in 1765, trying to warn the government about these abuses.
Yeah.
But they were just completely ignored.
And this is actually where these everyday farmers first begin popping into the historical record, right? We see them signing local petitions complaining about these exact fees.
Yes, that's exactly right. The petitions are a huge paper trail.
We will definitely circle back to those records because that is a total goldmine for anyone trying to trace their family tree. But so that was North Carolina, poor farmers fighting corrupt officials. South Carolina was dealing with a completely different reality, though.
It was almost the exact mirror image. In South Carolina, the regulators were actually wealthy, upcountry landowners. Their grievance wasn't a corrupt government. Their grievance was the total absence of government.
Wait, what do you mean?
The colonial assembly in Charleston simply hadn't bothered to provide courts, jails, or law enforcement for the backcountry. At all.
Meaning if you were robbed or attacked, you were entirely on your own.
Yes, and they were definitely being attacked. Roving bands of bandits were terrorizing the region, stealing horses, raiding homesteads. So these wealthy planters, led by figures like Reverend Charles Woodmason and James Mason, they essentially formed a massive vigilante group to establish order.
So they just took the law into their own hands.
They did. They targeted outlaws and transient hunters. But eventually, this South Carolina movement was actually resolved peacefully by legislative action. The colonial government passed the Circuit Court Act of 1769, which finally provided courts and sheriffs for the backcountry.
Oh, okay. So the South Carolina regulators just voluntarily disbanded after that.
Exactly. They got what they wanted.
So South Carolina gets this peaceful legislative fix, but North Carolina just boils over. Because the North Carolina regulators couldn't get justice in those rigged courts, they escalated to mass protests.
They really had no other choice.
Right. They formed associations, they refused to pay the unfair taxes, and in 1770, they rioted in Hillsborough. Like, they literally dragged corrupt officials like Edmund Fanning out into the street, beat them, and ran the judges out of town.
Which, as you can imagine, forced Governor Tryon's hand. He could not allow that level of blatant rebellion to just go unanswered. So he mobilized the colonial militia to march west and crush the uprising.
And that leads to this decisive confrontation that completely alters the map of American settlement. Let's talk about that battle, because the scale of it is staggering for a conflict most people have never even heard of. What did this look like on the ground?
This brings us to May 16, 1771, at Great Alamance Creek. Governor Tryon marched into the backcountry with an army of about 1,000 well-trained, well-supplied militia.
And many of those are the wealthy eastern planters we discussed earlier, right?
Exactly. And he brought 8 cannons. They faced off against roughly 2,200 regulators.
So, okay, the farmers have the numbers, but I imagine the weaponry and tactics are entirely mismatched.
Oh, completely mismatched. The regulators were completely disorganized and poorly armed. I mean, many didn't even have muskets. They were carrying farm tools, pitchforks, hunting rifles.
You can't fight a cannon with a pitchfork.
No, you really can't. And their primary leader, Herman Husband, was a devout Quaker. Because his religious beliefs strictly forbade violence, he actually mounted his horse and left the encampment before the battle even started.
Oh, wow. So he just left an untrained crowd facing down an organized military force.
He did. So Tryon lined up his army, formally read the Riot Act, and gave the regulators 1 hour to disperse and lay down their arms.
And the regulators supposedly yelled back, "Fire and be damned," right?
That's the legend, yeah. And Tryon did exactly that. He opened fire with grape shot from his artillery, followed by these devastating, coordinated militia volleys.
I can't even imagine.
It was brutal. The battle lasted about 2 hours, but it was a total rout. The regulators were completely shattered. Tryon's forces captured several prominent leaders, including Benjamin Merrill and James Pugh, who were later subjected to show trials and hanged for treason.
And then Tryon didn't just stop there, did he?
No, he engaged in a brutal scorched earth campaign. His army marched through the backcountry, burning regulator farms, destroying crops, and forcing the citizens to sign humiliating oaths of allegiance to the British crown.
Okay, but hang on, though. I was looking at the aftermath in the sources, and it says Tryon actually offered blanket pardons. Like, if all these farmers had to do was swear an oath of allegiance and hand over their guns, why uproot your entire family and walk into the wilderness?
That's a great question.
Was this just sheer panic from the artillery fire, or was something deeper going on?
It was a profound ideological break. It wasn't just fear of being shot. These people didn't merely lose a military skirmish. They lost their fundamental belief that the colonial system could ever be fair or reformed.
Ah, I see.
To take that oath meant submitting to the very courthouse ring that had been bankrupting them and stealing their farms for a decade. It meant accepting that the corruption was permanent.
So it's a bit like a pressure valve. The legal avenues for protest were completely capped and sealed by Tryon's military force. They couldn't vote the corruption out, they couldn't sue the corruption out, and now they couldn't shoot the corruption out.
Exactly.
So the demographic pressure had to blow out somewhere?
That pressure valve analogy is incredibly apt. And that blowout went directly over the mountains. They fundamentally rejected the coastal elite's authority, sparking this massive diaspora into the rugged, uncharted Appalachian frontier.
And the sheer volume of people who left is just staggering.
It really is.
Yes.
Take the Sandy Creek Baptist Church, for example. They were a major spiritual and community center for the Regulator movement in North Carolina. After the defeat at Alamance, their congregation plummeted from 606 families down to just 14 families.
Wait, really? 606 down to 14?
Yes.
That is an entire community, hundreds of families just picking up whatever they could carry and vanishing over the horizon. Where did they even go?
Well, by 1772, just a year after the battle, over 1,500 former regulators had abandoned North Carolina entirely. They pushed westward over the Blue Ridge Mountains into the remote river valleys, specifically the Watauga, the Nolichucky, and the Holston valleys in what is now northeastern Tennessee.
But wait, didn't King George issue the Proclamation of 1763? Like, didn't that strictly forbid colonial settlement west of the Appalachian Mountains?
It did, but they no longer cared about the King's proclamations. They intentionally moved beyond the reach of British law and coastal sheriffs. We see figures like James Robertson, a former regulator who explored the Watauga Valley and then traveled back to North Carolina to recruit 16 families to follow him into the mountains.
It's like water flowing around a boulder. Tryon's militarized colonial regime was this immovable boulder, and instead of trying to break it again, the regulators just flowed around it, pooling into the geographic crevices and remote watersheds of the Appalachian Mountains.
Exactly.
Yeah.
But they still had to survive.
Right. How does a rogue settlement like that actually function on a day-to-day basis if it's technically illegal and has no official government backing?
They had to invent their own society completely from scratch. They negotiated and leased the land directly from the Cherokee, totally bypassing the royal government.
Yep.
And then they formed what became known as the Watauga Association.
Which was an actual government, right?
Yes. This wasn't just a loose camp. It was an independent democratic government. They drafted a constitution, elected their own magistrates, recorded their own deeds, and formed their own militia. They essentially built the fair, self-regulated society they've been violently asking for back in North Carolina.
Okay, let's fast forward just a few years. These families have settled into their new mountain lives. They've built this rogue democracy. And then in 1775, the American Revolution breaks out.
Right, the big event.
And here's where it gets really interesting. You would naturally assume that these regulators, who literally spent a decade hating the royal governor, fighting colonial taxes, and rejecting British authority, would be the very first in line to join George Washington and the Patriots.
You would assume that, absolutely. But the reality of wartime allegiances in the backcountry was incredibly complex and deeply ironic.
Yeah.
You really have to look at who was actually leading the Patriot cause in North Carolina.
Okay, who was it?
It was men like Richard Caswell, James Moore, and Francis Nash.
Wait, let me get this straight. If you spent a decade violently protesting unfair taxes, why on earth would you side with... Wait, are these the same guys?
Yes, the guys saying no taxation without representation to King George were the exact same militia officers who fired cannons at the Regulators at Alamance.
That is massive cognitive dissonance. You're asking a farmer to fight for liberty alongside the sheriff who literally stole his farm and burned his house.
Exactly. Which is exactly why many former Regulators flat out refused to fight with the Patriots. I mean, for the Regulators, the enemy wasn't some distant parliament in London imposing a stamp act. The enemy was the local sheriff embezzling their money.
Right, the enemy is standing right in front of them.
Yes. Because of this deep-seated trauma, many Regulators just tried to remain neutral. Others, like James Hunter, actively became loyalists, taking up arms for the British. They believed the British Crown was the only entity powerful enough to protect them from the corrupt local patriot elites.
Wow. Did the allegiances in South Carolina flip in a similarly bizarre way?
They did, but mirroring their own specific pre-war conflict. In South Carolina, you'll remember, the Regulators were the wealthy vigilantes who established order, like James Mason.
Right, the guys hunting the bandits.
Exactly. When the Revolution started, those wealthy Regulators became patriots, largely to consolidate their own regional power.
So who became the Loyalists in South Carolina?
Their old enemies. The poorer settlers, the transient hunters, and the former bandits, often referred to in the records as scoffalites. Because they hated the wealthy upcountry planters who had acted as vigilantes against them, the scoffalites became loyalists, actively fighting against the patriot planters.
It is entirely a localized grudge match playing out under the grand banner of the American Revolution. People are choosing sides based on who their neighbor is, not what the king is doing in London.
Precisely. And this localized grudge match culminated in 1780 at the Battle of Kings Mountain. The British had a loyalist force, commanded by Major Patrick Ferguson, and he threatened to march over the mountains and lay waste to the frontier settlements.
Oh, big mistake.
Huge mistake. In response, the descendants of that original Regulator diaspora, the Overmountain men from the Watauga and Holston valleys, mustered their frontier militia, marched back over the Blue Ridge, and completely destroyed Ferguson's loyalist force.
And that was a huge turning point.
It was a massive turning point in the Revolution, and it was fought largely by men whose families had fled colonial authority a decade earlier.
That is just wild. Okay, so we mentioned earlier that these conflicts forced everyday people to generate a paper trail.
Right, the records.
If you are listening right now and you know you have roots in the Appalachian Mountains, or you're trying to find ancestors from this era, how do you actually use this chaotic history to your advantage?
The sources outline a very specific chain of evidence workflow for genealogists.
Yes, and it's a great workflow. Finding everyday frontier farmers in the 18th century is notoriously difficult because they usually avoided institutions. But because the regulator movement specifically targeted the courts, everyday people, tenants, artisans, smallholders, were dragged into the historical record.
So where do you start?
Step 1. The first place you want to look is civil records in Piedmont staging counties, like Orange and Rowan counties in North Carolina.
What kind of civil records are we talking about specifically? You want to look at court minutes, militia payrolls, prisoner guard accounts, and those early petitions against court fees we mentioned. For example, if you look at a militia account, you might see a cluster of men with the surname McNabb being paid to guard a prisoner during the riots.
Right, because the colonial government had to pay them, their names got written down.
Exactly. That suggests a kin group was resident near the county seat during the crisis. Then step 2. The next critical step is checking ecclesiastical or church records.
Why church records? Were they keeping better track of people?
Well, denominations like the Presbyterians and the Baptists operated with a very high degree of local autonomy. In the absence of a fair civil government, the church often stepped in as the moral authority. So their session minutes frequently recorded church discipline.
Oh, like people getting in trouble.
Yes. You might find an entry stating a church member was suspended, censured, or even excommunicated for riotous regulator behavior or for refusing to obey local magistrates.
So what does this all mean? It's essentially the 18th century social media timeline of who was hanging out with whom, who was causing trouble, and what the community thought about it.
That's a hilarious way to look at it, but yes, it provides incredible social context. And then step 3, once you've established them in the Piedmont, you connect them to the mountains using land grants.
How does that connect them?
After the suppression of the regulators, land records often explicitly note people's previous locations. You might find a land grant on the New River, the Holston, or the Watauga that describes the grantee as late of Orange County. That phrase is the bridge connecting the pre-war rebellion to the mountain migration.
Oh, that's the golden ticket right there. But the sources also give us some major warnings about using these records. There are definitely pitfalls to avoid when tracking these ancestors.
Oh, absolutely. You have to be very careful with interpretation. First, do not assume an ancestor was a committed ideological political leader of the regulators just because they show up on a list guarding a prisoner or mustering in a militia.
Because they could have just been drafted.
Right. The local sheriff had the power to conscript people. They may have just been forced to be there.
And spelling was entirely fluid back then, right? Like no one was checking IDs.
Extremely fluid. Surnames were spelled phonetically by whatever clerk was listening. A German name like Schmidt easily becomes Smith. A Scottish name like McNabb might be written as MNAB with an apostrophe. You really have to search for phonetic variations. You also have to rethink geography entirely.
In what way?
Legal documents from this era didn't always use neat county lines because the lines were constantly shifting or disputed. They used watersheds. A deed might say a farm was located on the waters of the Yadkin. You have to look at topographical maps, tracing rivers and ridgelines, rather than modern political boundaries.
And what if you are searching and searching, and there is just no record of your ancestor at all?
That raises a vital point about the archives themselves. Do not interpret an ancestor's absence from a record as loyalty to the crown or just political apathy.
Right, because paper burns.
Exactly. The records from this era are highly fragmented. Courthouses burned down, documents rotted in damp basements, and record-keeping on the frontier was spotty at best. Silence in the archives is often just a symptom of lost paper, not a lack of participation.
We've covered an incredible journey today. We started with the oppressive courthouse rings, extorting poor farmers in North Carolina, contrasting with the wealthy vigilantes trying to bring order to South Carolina.
Two very different movements.
Yeah, and we saw the tragic climax at the Battle of Alamance, where Tryon's artillery shattered the rebellion. But instead of ending the story, that defeat acted as a pressure valve, sparking a massive Appalachian diaspora that sent thousands of families over the mountains to create their own rogue societies, like the Watauga Association.
A completely new start.
And then the ultimate irony, when the revolution hit, the wounds of the Regulator movement were so deep that patriots and loyalists often chose sides based entirely on who their local enemies were, completely ignoring the politics in London.
And through all of that chaos, violence, and migration, they left a dense, fragmented paper trail in civil petitions, military payrolls, and church discipline records.
Which is just a goldmine for anyone trying to understand how their own family made the agonizing choice to abandon their homes and push into the deep mountains. It really makes you rethink how those neat lines on the map actually got drawn.
It requires a total paradigm shift. Okay. And I want to leave you with one final thought to ponder, looking back at the Watauga settlement we discussed.
Yeah, let's hear it.
We noted that the Watauga Association successfully functioned for years deep in the mountains, entirely without royal or state oversight. They created their own laws, their own courts, and their own defense. Does this historical reality prove that the regulators' original dream of a truly self-regulated, decentralized society was viable all along?
Oh, wow.
By fleeing over the mountains and starting from scratch, did these oppressed farmers essentially give us a glimpse of a completely alternate blueprint for American democracy?
An alternate blueprint born entirely out of chaos and rejection. That is fascinating to think about. It just goes to show the history of the frontier isn't a neat, orderly progression at all. It is a wonderfully murky, complex story of everyday people figuring out survival and justice as they go. Thanks for joining us on this deep dive. Keep questioning the map, and we'll catch you on the next one.
Thank you for listening to this installment of the Appalachian Historical Review. Remember to visit the digital archive at AppalachianGenealogy.com. Join us next time for further study into the records and history of the Appalachian region.